And welcome to today's Irish Studies seminar. As usual, we're having a hybrid event, so we've got people joining us online. Hi to everyone on Teams and also an audience here in the room. Today's speaker is the local talent. So we have Professor Keith Lilley, known to many people in the room, I'm sure. Keith is Professor of Geography in the School of Natural and Built Environment here in Queen's. He's a historical geographer with particular research experience in interpreting historical landscapes, maps, and built environments. And he's published widely on the history of medieval mapping in Europe and has an interest in historical mapping right the way through to the present. He's the co-director of the OS 200 project and also the convener of the Heritage Hub here in Queen's. And it's on the OS 200 project he's going to talk to us about today. So this is OS 200, digitally remapping Ireland's Ordnance Survey heritage, which is a cross-disciplinary and supranational project using digital humanities tools and methods to open up the map to reveal otherwise hidden geographies of field encounters across Ireland and the practices of those employed and engaging in the survey. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Keith, who's going to talk to us about mapping encounters, exploring the spaces and places of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along, the online and also here in person. Really appreciate it. After a long Monday, teaching, I've been teaching as well, so it's really appreciated. So you have the title up there, which mapping encounters, exploring the spaces and places of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. What I'm going to be talking about really is two projects. One of the ones you just heard, OS 200, which is funded by the Irish Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and another project which is allied to it but on a different scale called Mapping Monuments, which is focused on the north coast of Northern Ireland, and that's funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And I want to focus on those two projects to explore these spaces and places of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. So I am a geographer, so I'm going to come to the table, so to speak, as a geographer, come to this table as a geographer, thinking about the landscapes through which and within which maps from the Ordnance Survey in Ireland were produced. So that's my particular approach. So a bit like the Institute of Irish Studies, and this is the first talk I've given to the Institute, it's a very much a sort of transdisciplinary project, what we're trying to do here. So it cuts across archaeology, history, literature, linguistics, manuscript studies, digital humanities, so it's quite into cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary. So I'm hoping what I have to say will suit the audience, both in the room and also online. So I hope you'll get something out of this. But also the Ordnance Survey, the maps, so many of us use them, and they're so accessible, especially these days, through online resources like the Prony Historical Map Viewer for Northern Ireland, or the GeoHive for the island of Ireland. And now also the National Library of Scotland have also started putting up the 6-inch Ordnance Survey maps from Ireland and different editions. So more and more of this material is available, and there was wide public interest in it. And for us, one of the kind of key markers for us is next year, 2024, is the bicentenary of the beginnings of the Ordnance Survey on the island of Ireland, so in 1824. So the projects I'm talking about today and some of the initial findings are with that sort of endpoint in mind, to sort of have something to say, a new story to tell about the Ordnance Survey in Ireland in 2024 for the bicentenary. So that's the kind of context. My own particular interest in as a geographer is I am very much a field person. So although I work in archives, work in libraries like many of us do, and that is still the field, I suppose, in inverted commas, scare quotes. But I like to be outdoors in the wide open spaces. So I want to sort of reflect some of that in what I'm going to be talking about. But also I want to use that as a sort of way of framing the Ordnance Surveys, to think about the field as a place of encounter, a cultural encounter 200 years ago. So that's the kind of sort of arena really I'm interested in exploring here through these spaces and places of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. Okay, so with a bit of preamble there. I thought I'll start with this fairly well used and fairly provocative image. And I've been having some discussion with some some colleagues about this particular image. It actually comes, as you can see there, I don't know why it says at the bottom there, stop share. Can I hide that little thing there so it doesn't get in the way of it? Okay, so it actually comes from the Ordnance Survey Jubilee book, which was produced by the Ordnance Survey Queen Victoria in 1887 or for 1887. The image itself purports to show royal sappers and miners in 1837. Pictured there in all their finery. It's usually seen to be an image representing the surveyors in Ireland, but it doesn't specifically, I don't think, say that. Certainly doesn't say in terms of the caption. But nevertheless, it's widely used. Now, I quite like it because it is provocative and because it makes us think about the field as a site of encounter. So thinking about the ways in which the surveyors, and they weren't armed, actually, the instructions issued to the surveyors by Thomas Colby, said that the surveyors weren't to be armed. So, and also, they clearly look quite militaristic. So I think this is why this image gets used quite a lot, because it sort of speaks to a particular kind of way of viewing the Ordnance Survey. We might want to come on to that in due course. But I suppose for me, what I find more interesting really is what's going on in the background, the ways in which the surveyors at the top left there are occupying a point. So the surveying itself is, it has all this kind of language about occupying, about control points, so it's quite disciplined, but it's also about surveillance. Surveillance obviously go hand in hand. So those two chaps up there have got their theodolites and they're taking some observations and readings against the beacon, the trigonometrical station on the other side of the hill there. It looks a bit like an Irish landscape, but I think you would agree, that kind of rolling landscape with the water, it could be a drumlin landscape in County Down for all we know. And then the camp as well, you see the chaps down there with their tents and so on. So I like this image because it opens up that landscape of survey to us. However problematic as in inverted commas, accurate representation of the activities of surveyors in the 1820s it might be, but it helps us to think about these spaces and places of survey in and of the field. And that's really what I want to journey us through the field of 200 years ago. That's really what I want to try and do today. And I'm going to do it very visually. So it's going to be death by PowerPoint. There'll be lots of maps, lots of images, okay. And I appreciate some of you at the back may not necessarily all see the details, but hopefully you shall. Now, the little quotation, I thought a little bit of conceptual kind of reflection as a geographer. Now, place, I always say to my students, place and space are not synonyms. Okay, they are different things. We talk about place and space differently. And Ifru Tuan, who died relatively recently actually, but wrote some amazing stuff about play. Topophilia was his thing, the love of places. So, and the little quotation comes from Ifru Tuan. If we think of space as that which allows movement, then place is pause. And that's how we differentiate. So we understand space through the ways we traverse it, the way we move across it and around it. And you'll see that in due course as I try and track our surveyors through and across Ireland. That's very much about thinking about space, but also those surveyors occupying places, thinking about those chaps with their theodolite. It's about place, about a particular point. So I'm going to take us to particular places as well as spaces of this encounter. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to do here through these mapping encounters. Now, there's a big literature on this, and these books I'm sure will be familiar to many of us in the room and also online as well. Going back to John Andrews's still, monumental study, really very much, I suppose, still regarded as the authoritative work on the Ordnance Survey in Ireland, a paper landscape, Ordnance Survey in 19th-century Ireland. And an impressive piece of scholarly research, largely drawing on archival material. Okay, and that's true for a lot of this tradition in the histories of the Ordnance Survey on the island of Ireland. Tends to be very much textually orientated, textually based. So what I'm trying to draw out with is what I call here archaeologies of cartography. I'm going to do that in two ways. One way is looking at the landscape and what archaeologies we might be able to establish or find through looking at landscape archaeology. But I also think about archaeology in a more metaphorical sense of excavating the map. And we can begin to excavate the map digitally. And that's where the digital humanities tools and methodologies become really useful to us, because we can analyze maps and we can find things in those maps which are not otherwise evident on the surface, so to speak. So it's a bit like archaeology digging down into the map. That's the idea. That's why I'm using it metaphorically. And that's therefore different to this otherwise very kind of textual tradition of writing about the history of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland, which is, you know, still brilliant stuff, but we're trying to offer something slightly different through these projects I've mentioned, mapping monuments and OS 200. So the field itself is an sort of arena in the history of cartography, which is relatively underexplored, which to me is slightly paradoxical. Historians of cartography, historians of maps, tend to focus much more on the end product, i.e. the map, and much less upon those spaces and places in the landscape through which and by which maps are made through surveying. So this is Matthew Edney. It's a quotation from some work. Matthew Edney is one of the editors of the Chicago History of Cartography. So he's really huge in the field. Sorry, we talk about the field as a discipline, but we also about the field as a place. We might get into that. Anyway, so he says here, a key problem is that despite the centrality of fieldwork to the modern cartographic ideal, i.e. the field is central to the making of maps in the modern context, map historians have been happy to leave fieldwork and surveying well enough alone. We might ask ourselves why that is. Unexamined and untheorized. Even critical map scholars have avoided the issue of the relationship of field work to the graphic map. So my approach then is to think, okay, well, what's the field contribute and what is going on in the field in the making of maps? And using the Ordnance Survey as a way of exploring that and addressing that, that issue that Edney is identifying here for us. So it's to trying to put the field back into the history of cartography fundamentally. The Ordnance Survey, I'm not going to give you a history of the Ordnance Survey. That's not really what this is about. I'm interested in the field as a site of encounter, but nevertheless, I thought it would be useful at least to put it into some sort of context there. There are these sorts of books. I could put that on camera here as well. The Ordnance Survey in Ireland, an illustrated record, which was produced by the Ordnance Surveys North and South in 1991, and that's where this quotation comes from. About the origins of the Ordnance Survey. Early in the 19th century, it became obvious that the local tax in Ireland, which was called the county cess, based on town units, were inequitable. Finally, on the recommendations of the Spring Rice Committee, Survey of all Ireland, the scale of 6 inches to 1 mile was authorised by British Parliament in 1824. Hence, then we get these 6-inch Ordnance Survey maps, which we are all familiar with and like to use. That's an example from Benevena on the north coast in County Derry, Londonderry. And as part of that sort of writing about the Ordnance Survey, then we have a huge amount of material from the time, which is really useful to us to understand the processes and the practices of fieldwork and survey under the Ordnance Survey, like Thomas Colby's instructions for the Interior Survey of Ireland, as you can see there from 1825, and right down, and this is the instructions given to the surveyors, right down, this comes actually from John Andrews's paper landscape, where it's reproduced. But things like each district is to be furnished with a standard chain and proper marks are to be laid off from the standard chain and so on and so forth. You know, very much around the working practices and the instrumentation and so on that the Ordnance Survey had in the field, the chains in the picture on the top right, and that huge 3-foot theodolite, which they were lugging around the whole island doing their trigonometrical survey, which is an important part of the beginnings of the Ordnance Survey. So 2 projects then, Peter's already mentioned this one. This is the OS 200 project, which is the one I mentioned, funded by the Irish Research Council and the AHRC. It connects across Queen's, Prony, Royal Irish Academy, University of Limerick, Digital Repository of Ireland. Who have I forgotten? You know, it's quite a sort of cross, sort of very sort of typical of the kind of current kind of sort of funding landscape, really, quite kind of certainly interdisciplinary, but also it's a sort of bilateral funding program which is orientated to the digital humanities. And we're very fortunate to get that funding. And as it says up there, the idea is to put together a digital corpus which re-aggregates the Ordnance Survey records, which were actually over time sort of separated out. So the maps, the Ordnance Survey letters, the memoirs and so on, you know, all kind of separated out. We want to digitally reconstitute that corpus, you know, put it back together digitally, but then also analyze it. And it's the results of those analyses, which I want to show you today as well. So I'm going to move on. So this is really the essence of our corpus, the sources, the memoirs, the Ordnance Survey memoirs up there, which of course have been published by the Institute of Irish Studies in collaboration with the Royal Irish Academy many years ago and still in print. Okay, so we have that print. Now, what we have from Angelique Day is a kind of digital version of that, where the before it became printed edition, she had this sort of big textual version. So we've got that to use. There's the Ordnance Survey letters. Again, some of these are available online already, but we want to actually make them more useful. So they're not just images, they're actually mineable. They becomes intelligent data, if you like, if we begin to actually scan these things and use OCR techniques. I'm not going to get too technical in this because I didn't really think that was the point of this talk. It's more about what this means rather than about the nuts and bolts. And also, I'm kind of the wrong person because we have people like Zenobia Garrett, our postdoctoral researcher at Limerick, who is a specialist in all this sort of thing. So we should really have Zenobia here and the whole team, not just me, because all of this is a team effort. The Ordnance Survey name books, you'll see more of that in due course. And then the thing that really, I suppose, interests me most as a geographer, perhaps, are the maps. And it's really the maps I'm going to be focused on particularly today. So I hope that's not too disappointing for anybody. If you're looking for more on the name books, the memoirs, and the letters, please don't walk out. There will be a bit of that in there as well. Okay, moving on. So the other project, Mapping Monuments, is very different. It's a public engagement project. It's a kind of community archaeology project. And it's run through the Benevola and Coastal Lowlands Landscape Partnership Scheme, which is organised by the Causeway Glens and Causeway Glens Heritage Trust. Is that right? Causeway Coast and Glens Heritage Trust. Thank you. Yes, and colleagues up there on the north coast, like Grace McAllister and Andrew Bratton, and also colleagues here at Queen's as well. So it's a very different kind of project, but it's much more oriented towards the landscape evidence. And what I want to do in this talk is draw on both. So I want to draw out the landscapey stuff from this project, but the more mining the maps, excavating the maps, if you remember that metaphor, the archaeology of cartography, I want to use that sort of approach to look using the Ordnance Survey to the OS 200 project. Now, if you are interested, there is on the 17th of November a conference, and it's going to be at Ballykelly up on the north coast, a day conference, and you'll see details in just a moment about that. So those are the two projects. Now, the Mapping Monuments project really relates to point one. So I've divided my talk really into two main parts. The third part is more the conclusion or reflection, really. But the first main part draws on the Mapping Monuments project, and is to actually look at the landscape traces, as I said, from field to map, so actually going into the landscape and mapping the evidence for the Ordnance Survey from the landscape. So what archaeological traces did the OS leave behind in the landscape? How might we interpret those? So that's the Mapping Monuments project. The second part, main part, and that's really the biggest part of the talk, from map to field, is actually excavating the maps and excavating the textual material to understand those surveying encounters in the field. So mapping the hidden geographies of the field is what we're getting at there. Then the third bit there is really just this more kind of critical reflection, because, draws breath, the Ordnance Survey does come with a lot of baggage, does it not? And 2024, we're used to a decade of anniversaries here, so we might want to see the Ordnance Survey bicentenary as part of that contested history, contested heritage sort of discussion, debate, and so on. Okay, so let's move on. So the point of the Mapping Monuments project really was to get back into the field. So remember what I said about the historiography of the history of the Ordnance Survey is very much a textual thing. We wanted to say, well, okay, what's the landscape tell us about the Ordnance Survey and its activities? And we focused, this map actually shows you part of what's called a trigonometrical survey of Great Britain and Ireland. The two were connected. And the trigonometrical survey, without getting again too technical in that, is a way of deducing distances from indirect measurements using a theodolite. And it's based on a series of triangles, and it's those different triangles that you can see here on this map. And that triangulation, it's called, was carried out as part of the first survey work by the Ordnance Survey in the 1820s. So when we talk about 1824, that's what we're talking about, trigonometrical survey, first and foremost. And the area I'm interested in is, I don't know if people can see this one, I'm pointing at it, but up on the north coast, a series of what are called trigonometrical stations, where that huge 3-foot theodolite was set up by the OS on summits, including Divis, including Troston, including Slieve Snaght, Saul, and they're all on this map here if you can see it. So we're interested here then in the 1820s in these trigonometrical survey operations, the field survey operations. there's the 3-foot field of light, which has been lugged around at that time. Why the North Coast? The North Coast around Lough Foyle was really important in the early survey of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. It was the place that the OS laid out what's called a baseline, which was a measurement between 2 fixed points, and from which they could then calculate the distances between the indirect measurements from the summits across the whole island through the triangulation process. So this baseline is unusual, and this is why we wanted to focus on it, because it actually leaves a physical and tangible trace in the landscape. And this is it. Okay, I don't know if anybody's been up to the North Coast and visited the area around McGilligan, just to the below Benevena. If you know Benevena, the loft, if you get the train to Derry and you go through Ballerina and you look up to your left as you're going towards Derry, you'll see Benevena, the cliffs, and on the right hand side you look across Lough Foyle to the Inishowen Peninsula. So that's where we are here. We're looking across Lough Foyle to the Inishowen Peninsula, and you see in the field here that thing, which looks a bit like a burial mound, doesn't it? And it's interesting, actually, the OS, well, I think it's interesting, the Ordnance Survey at the time called these chambers, they even referred to it as a tumulus. So they're almost using that language of prehistory, really, of archaeology to describe these monuments in the landscape, which are part of the baseline. It was down to this chap, Thomas Colby, that we had the establishment of the baseline in this area. It was really Colby and his fellow surveyors that were looking for establishing a baseline which required quite a flat, lowish area. So the quotation here, I made a cursory examination of the general idea of the country, the landscape, and to seek a proper place for the measurement of a new baseline, and the shores of Lough Foyle presented most advantageous for this purpose. Okay, and this is that process of measurement taking place. So it's again quite a well used, it's in this book, it's why I used image of the baseline measurements, a very precise measurement of a distance between these 2 fixed points, between McGilligan and Ballykelly to the south, McGilligan in the north. And so you see the tents there, you see the chaps there looking down at, and there's another tent in the background. So this is an illustration actually, which was it's rather later in date than the actual measurement itself is the 1820s. But nevertheless done by the Ordnance Survey to kind of celebrate this achievement. It was very much seen as an achievement. Colby's bars, some of them still survive. That's one in the Ordnance Survey of Ireland's museum in Dublin, Phoenix Park. And what makes this different and special, and for us as a project for mapping monuments, you know, something we want to kind of elevate its significance of, is Colby's approach is very different to Mudge. Mudge was his predecessor of the Ordnance Survey in Britain, and the baseline that was created on Salisbury Plain used an upended cannon. Do you see that on the right hand side? That is a cannon that's been upended and dropped into the earth, and that upended cannon is, you can see on the map, it says gun, end of base. So that's how the baseline was demarcated in the landscape. Now obviously this thing could move, all right, the gun itself, you know, the barrel could move, and also the survey was undertaken with chains, which are flexible. So the thing that Colby did was quite different. He used these things, these base stations. The one on the right was the initial design, and the idea was you have in there like a stone block and a piece of metal, and on that metal you have a mark, piece of metal you have a mark, and that is the point which is measured to and from. Very different to the upended cannon. And the idea was, you see it's got like a cork in the top of this bottle type monument. The idea was you could, and this is how it was described, you'd lift off that cork and you'd lower a child, a boy, it says in the account, you lower a boy down, you can imagine there'd be no windows in this thing, it'd be a terrible thing really, down to clean it or inspect the plate or whatever. Anyway, that wasn't the actual end design. This was the design that was used in the end. That's what you saw in that photograph, albeit now in plan form and elevation. So it's the same idea of having a stone block, a metal plate and so on, but protected. So I think Colby recognized the significance of what he was doing through the Lough Foyle measurement of the baseline, and in a sense monumentalizing it in the landscape. So there's physical traces in the landscape. So important that Everest came over from England to inspect what was going on and took the idea back to India actually. So this is what the monuments still survive in the landscape. This is near Ballykelly. I'm going to whiz through some of these now because of time. Those are our different summit stations in relation to the Lough Foyle baseline, which is in green there. And each of these summit stations were staffed by the surveyors of various military rank, as you can see there, but normally trained through the Royal Engineers, but actually not part of British military, but rather part of the Ordnance Survey as an organisation for mapping. On Slieve Snaght, we still have some remains possibly of these summit stations and the summit camp. Got a little quotation here from Drummond to Colby about being up on top of Slieve Snaght in the showing, about the difficulties of the conditions and so on. You can imagine trying to take their observations, even moving the instrument itself. This is an equivalent in Scotland, and there's an archaeology here which has not really been surveyed. So part of the Mapping Monuments project is to revisit these sites. This is Slieve Donard. Then if you've been up to the top of Slieve Donard, you might know where the wall comes together at that point, the Mourne Wall, where the current trigonometrical pillar is, the concrete thing. And that was where the summit station was. But you see on the aerial photograph these other kind of traces in the landscape, these structures, very similar to what we've seen in Scotland. This is a view from the summit itself. So we're interested in these sorts of traces in the landscape and trying to work out, for example, where the men camped when they measured the baseline. This is all through the Mapping Monuments project again, and going out into the field and following in the footsteps of the surveyors. So we have a group of volunteers who have given up their time to come and join us to do this research in the field. So that's me and some of the volunteers with our ranging poles, literally following in the footsteps. Those red lines show where the Ordnance Survey surveyors traced through the landscape, through their levelling lines, their chaining lines. So we kind of reverse engineer from the map to the field. We used the map as a way of guiding us into the landscape to recover the spots where the Ordnance Survey themselves had been. And that's what we were doing in that previous image. Okay, so we were trying to trace them in the landscape. I'm going to come back to that at the end because it raised some interesting and provocative issues actually at the time, because this was filmed by the BBC by Niall McCracken, and it was put online and it was put on Twitter, and there's a very interesting Twitter response to the project, what we were doing, which really opened my eyes actually. But anyway, there we all are. And I think what this shows us really is the arduousness of that process of survey. You know, when you're out in the field being buffeted by the wind and the rain and everything else, and you're trying to drag your ranging poles, and they would have had chains, it really makes us realize the monumentality of the task itself, I think. So it's a kind of almost like an ethnography of cartography that we're trying to work through here by going back into the field ourselves. Right, that's enough. That's Mapping Monuments. Okay, so how long have I got? Another 15 minutes. So this is now moving on to looking more at the maps themselves and how we can begin to excavate these maps, like the way I mentioned at the start, to map out our hidden geographies of the field. So the Ordnance Survey 200 project principally. So we're interested in the Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps, which have a huge amount of information in them. This little quotation you'll be familiar with, I'm sure. And Brian Friel has a lot. We love the map. We love translations, but you know, it actually also causes some difficulties as well. Again, you'll see that in due course. And Andrews and Friel, they had these arguments. You're probably familiar with this, but going back about what would it be now, 30 years ago, perhaps. Between the two, so we're sort of caught between the two, really, is why I'm putting these up here. Okay, just a reminder, so we're looking at the digital corpus in this part of the talk. I'm going to focus mainly on the 6-inch maps, but I will make reference to the name books as well. Okay, so in terms of our database, I mentioned Zenobie Garrett's. Again, I'm not going to get technical here, but what Zenobie suggested is that in terms of our data, our corpus, we focus on 3 main things, which are person, place, and event. So what we need to do for all of our sources is index them using these 3 categories. And that way we can actually then analyze people across all the sources. We can analyze places, we can analyze events, and we can also look at connections between them. So digitally, you know, using the digital tools and so on. So that's the idea here. And all of this is spatially referenced. So it's linked into a spatial database, a geographical information system, which means we can produce map outputs. So we can begin to map the map makers. We can begin to map the surveyors. I put this up because this has been a long, just saying, Peter, it's been a long process. Like all digital humanities research, there's a lot of investment of getting the database together. But once it's there, we can do, I think, amazing things. And I have just some work in progress outputs from this to show you today. So the different states of play in relation to the different sources we've been using, the letters, the memoirs, the name books. Some of them already in a digital ready format, some of them already OCR up to a character recognized, so they're already broken down into like usable digital formats. Some of them indexed, some of them not. So a real mixture, and we've had to kind of harmonize all of those. Now, this is a really important point. This particular slide shows you the geographies of these sources that we're using. So the Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps, clearly ubiquitous, cover the whole of the island. If we look at the memoirs, many of you know, of course, they cover the north principally. But if you split the text and the drawings, they actually have two slightly different geographies, interestingly enough, as you can see there. From the purple represents the source, including the OS database. The yellow, no source exists. So you can see the differences in the memoirs. The letters, likewise, there's an interesting geography there. Quite a lot of the island covered, but not all of it. And the name books, the whole of the island is covered. But because of the level of detail in the Ordnance Survey name books, we just did not have the capacity to do all of them. So my colleagues in linguistics, that's Angus Finnegan in Limerick and Micheál Amanan and Francis Kane, as like the place name experts really, decided that we would focus on the border counties because we were interested in this sort of issue about language and place names between, on the cusp, so to speak, because it had resonance for people today, of course, as well, and tapping into those debates around Friel. So the maps themselves, we have a collection in the map library in geography. They're very precious, the paper volumes here. They have been scanned, they've been digitized, but there's no kind of intelligence to those scans. They're simply there to be looked at, pan, zoomed, etc. There's no kind of intelligence to them. So all the text, for example, has not been digitized, that sort of thing. The date, as many of us in the room be familiar with that, the long range of date, 1829 to 1842, of the process of creating these 6-inch Ordnance Survey maps. And again, a marker, I suppose, for the bicentenary, the 6-inch maps, the first ever large-scale survey of an entire country. So it was at the time cutting edge in the way that QUB was cutting edge with the baseline. The mapping at 6 inches was also cutting edge. Oh yes, I mentioned the Prony Historical Map Viewer. Now National Library of Scotland have got this up online, which is an amazing resource, Chris Fleet at NLS. So we've seen progress in the availability of the maps. These are going to be soon available in the georeference format, which means that the maps will know where they are in relation to other maps. So you can overlay them and change transparency and all sorts of exciting things. But where we're going with our work is, for the first time, is bringing the maps into dialogue with the other sources. That's what I mean about the corpus. So the maps and the texts will be brought together. So rather than just having the maps separated out or the letters separated out, they will be brought together. So this is a work in progress of our resource that the Digital Repository of Ireland is doing a lot of work for us on. It doesn't look too, it is a very much sort of prototype, so it won't look exactly like this, but it gives you an indication. So this is just zooming into a particular area. It will be possible then within our townlands to identify particular sources and then to navigate through the map to the source. Also the other way around, it's a searchable database. So if you're interested in a particular place or a particular person or a particular event, you can search it, and that will then take you to the map window. So there'll be that connection between map and text, which I think is important. So trying to re-aggregate the OS archive. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about now, again, lots of maps, but lots of colourful maps to show you what we get when we begin to analyse these maps in terms of the surveyors who are named upon them. So I'm going to focus on the maps bit first in that sequence. Here's an example. Rebecca Milligan, one of our researchers, painstakingly went through every, because this data doesn't exist anywhere else in digital format, went through every single volume and every single sheet for the 6-inch first edition, and she recorded, photographed, but also recorded the names on the OS, on the margins of the map. The Prony Historical Map Viewer doesn't include the margins, they were cropped. So the only way we could do this is going back to our map library and laboriously, poor Rebecca, putting all this stuff into our database. So we now have the whole of Ireland, this sort of biographical information. So the field on the map, this is those surveyors in the field recorded on the maps, their names and their rank, sometimes their rank, but also where they were, the Royal Engineers and so on. Sometimes it's the surveyors, sometimes it's the engravers, sometimes it's both. And then because we're working with a geographic information system, we can actually visualize this in terms of its geographies. This is just from County Waterford. I'm going to range across Ireland for this part of the talk. So those boxes there represent individual 6-inch sheets, the 6-inch map sheet. Okay, and in each of those 6-inch map sheets, now we've got that data set from Rebecca's work. We know the names of those men associated with those particular sheets. So we can map out where the surveyors were. And there's some interesting patterns that emerge from this if we begin to do that. For the whole of Ireland as well, we can begin very readily to look at the progress of the survey. And again, John Andrews has something like this in his book, Paper Landscape. But starting in the north, as we know, in 1829, you can see there right at the very top, and then gradually working southwards to 1842 down in County Cork and County Kerry. And what you can see from that map is a very slow start. Do you see how it's, let's say, for the colours, 1829 through to about 1832, there's not much progress. But as you move south, there's big blocks of colour. So they're covering much more ground as you become further south. And that's what I mean about enabling, these tools enable us to see things, these hidden geographies, which are not otherwise very readily visible on the maps themselves. So you start analysing them and visualising them. On the right-hand side there is the engraving start year. So there's a survey start year, and then there's the engraving. You might expect, obviously, some separation, that you do the survey work and then you do the map work, the engraving. So we can begin to compare those two, and that's what's on the right-hand. I did say it'd be death by PowerPoint, didn't I? Okay, lots of maps. On the right, the different colours represent the differences in the stages between the two, between the survey and the engraving. So, and that's it by year. So in some cases, they were very close together in green, and in other cases, they were quite far apart. So that map on the right-hand side tells us something about that process, but it's not random, is it? You know, it's not a random distribution map of different colours. There are patterns of colours, which means something is going on. You know, something behind this. So there's lots of areas which are red, and they're all geographically together. They're not kind of separated. You see what I mean? They're not sort of separated out all over the place. And really, that's what we're looking for here. We're looking for patterns, evidence through our mapping out of the maps. So one thing we try to do through Rebecca's work is to map out the surveyors. Okay, so I'm going to probably turn this way so I can see what I'm looking at here. I put my other specs on. So on the right-hand side there, those different colours represent, you can probably just about see their names, the names of surveyors. Sometimes the surveyors are working in teams or pairs. Sometimes they're named on the map individually. But again, there are patterns. It's not random. You can begin to see the colours are blocks of colour. So there's something going on here, again, in how the surveyors are working in the field and how they're working, careering their way through Ireland is how, you know, careering quite, you know, barging their way to Ireland, but as careerist surveyors working that way through the across the whole island. I'm going to focus on Tucker, which I've highlighted here. And the other thing we can begin to do is begin to visualize the work of the surveyors as a graph rather than as a map. This was Zenobi's work. I quite like this because what it shows again is the kind of summit, in inverted commas, that the surveyors had to climb. Now, as well as those summits like Sleeve Snack they were climbing up, they also had this mountain to climb of doing their survey work. So you can see there the percentage of total townlands on the left-hand side, and the dates on the bottom there from 1829 to 1842, and then the surveyors represented by different colours. But there's a really huge ramping up of the survey work, as you can see there, from 1831 to about 1837, really steep climb as they get their way, move their way across Ireland, and then finish up. Henry James, so we can pick out individual surveyors. Henry James is quite important in the history of the Ordnance Survey because he ended up as Director General. And we can begin to track his career not only in terms of his broader career, but his career in Ireland as part of the Ordnance Survey of Ireland. And those different colours again represent, I want to be very clear to you there, but they represent the different stages as James worked his way through from north to south, you know, in the purple there in the north, and then later on down towards the south. One of the individuals we looked at is this chap, Henry Tucker, who was working across Ireland like James. There was some correspondence, like the correspondence here with John O'Donovan, but Tucker was out in the field, in the landscape. And there's a bit of a sad tale which indicates on the right-hand side here. He was seen as a candidate, as a successor to Colby, who was, in the end, it became Yolland. But Tucker was considered, but as it says there, he was turned down on account of his deafness. Then he was sent over to the West Indies, where he died. So, you know, you can begin to look at the biographies of these surveyors more generally, but also more specifically. So maybe I don't need to spend so long on these bits because it's quite detailed, but it begins to get some sense of that trajectory, that traverse through the landscape, through these surveyors' careers. So they're starting off in the north there and working, you can see the different colours represented. But you can also see that's Tucker in relation to other surveyors like him. Again, there's a geography to this, is there not? You know, it's not like Tucker is randomly going, 1 minute is over in Down, County Down, the next minute is over in County Galway. There is a logic, the kind of geographical rationale to this, which is evident from these visualizations. So we have 3 different surveyors here, and you can see they have each distinct geographies. And that's really all we're trying to pull out here from these maps, are the trajectories of the individuals and their relationships to each other. So we've done this for Tucker, which is the black outline boxes there, in relation also to other surveyors as well. So you know, we can spend more time on this later on if you wish in the discussion, but it's the visual representation that's important here, how we can begin to see where they're going and who they're working alongside, those relationships with each other. So we've done this for a whole, because we have this information through the map sheets from the 1830s through to the 1840s. So we can actually plot out, in this case, this is Henry Tucker, starting off in the northeast, and then gradually see the dates changing, 1833, gradually working his way southwards. I won't spend a lot of time on the details, but they're there for you to read if you wish to. Gradually moving southwards, and sometimes working in relationship to other survey teams, and sometimes more independently. Sometimes these survey teams overlap, sometimes they're separated out. But we would not see this if it wasn't for this process of visualizing through the digitizing of those names on the maps. So you can see it's sort of like a front sort of moving southwards, isn't it? You know, especially we've seen all these floods recently. We're so used to radar images of rainfall, and that's what it kind of reminds me of. It's like these patches of rainfall as the surveyors moving southwards. There were some folks in Galway, but it's still Tucker is over in the east. Tucker works all the way down the east coast, basically, all the way down to the southeast here, okay, to the end. So he's with the survey for the whole time period. So that is one way. That's looking at, remember I talked about space and movement. So that's the spacey bit. Think about space and the movement through the landscape, moving across Ireland through these surveyors. But there's also place, the pause bit. So the other thing we can begin to do, and this is Zenobi's work again, really, for manner, you can begin to see the map sheets from the different colours. You know, they kind of form a little rectangle, don't they? But this time we've used the townlands as a way of visualising the surveyors. And this is the numbers of surveyors in townlands. And again, there's a distinctive geography to this, which is curious. And I want to know more, you know, why we get this sort of geography. Like sometimes the green shows where there are 4 surveyors, okay, and again the contiguous townlands where you have 4 surveyors right up against another set of townlands on a different sheet where you have 2 surveyors. There's something odd going on there. Well, odd in my mind. You know, why are we getting this pattern? What is it about the decision making that might be behind this? But again, an interesting sort of visualization. And equally, if we map out the surveyors involved, again named on the map sheets, there's a pattern here, there's a geography. So there's some significance to this. And it's trying to understand what these hidden geographies might mean in terms of the processes and practices of encounters in the field. The graphs also help us to visualize not only the surveyors, but also how these individuals were multitasking. So they were sometimes engraving, they were sometimes drawing, they were sometimes surveying. So they had lots of different occupations, if you like. And as you can see, there's some more than others there. This is for County Fermanagh. And this is a way of visualizing that. So it's for Durnford, one of the surveyors working for Fermanagh, but also involved in drawings in the memoirs, because the surveyors were skilled in sketching as well as map making. And there's the sketches that we see in the memoirs. I'm nearly done. All right, so this then is just a little reminder of what we've been looking at, is that biographical information around the map, which enables us to excavate the map, to look behind the map, if you like, to how it was produced in the field. So this is an example from Scotland and also from Yorkshire, where you get that marginal information like we have in Ireland. These are 6-inch maps from the National Library of Scotland as well. But then something happens with the Ordnance Survey, because this is Derbyshire. Oh, sorry, no, that's Yorkshire. Then we go to Derbyshire just a little bit later. So we're over in England, obviously, now. And in Derbyshire, we have, by about the 1870s there, a sort of anonymization of the sheets. It's as if the surveys become made invisible. Now, I've talked to people from the Charles Close Society about this, why this happens. Why is it in the earlier stage of the Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps, you get their names, and then you get this transition to them kind of being almost sort of silenced. So it's kind of curious. I want to end on some name books, because this is hot off the press, again, thanks to Zenobi. So we haven't yet really done much analysis of the memoirs, the name books and the letters, because we're still in that process of pulling it all together in the database. So this is based upon the name books which she has got. And remember the geography of the name books, we're focusing on only the border counties. So right, so that's why you're looking at this. There's gaps on the map here. That's our making. But if you look at those coloured areas, the number of variants, so these are place name variants recorded in the name of the townland in the Ordnance Survey name books, okay? So some of them, 13 to 27, there's a lot of variants recorded, County Sligo, for example, and there are other parts out towards the east, very few, 1 or 2. Interesting geographies, again, and demanding maybe our explanation, why it is that you get, for example, as you can see there in County Armagh, those juxtapositions between some townlands which really have very few variants recorded and some which have many. So we're getting really here to the individuals, the recording, the process of documenting those place names in the field. And then this is Irish names, okay, and again, an interesting geography here. Suggested Irish names, a lot of purple on the map, but if you move down to the greens and the yellows, you will see these spots where there's a green spot there near Loch Earn, there's a yellow spot there near Coolca, and so on. Quite interesting geographies, which I think again demand our sort of explanation really, as trying to understand what's going on with these. And maybe you'll have explanations for me, which I need to look at, will be appreciated. I'm going to end with, definitely overstayed my welcome. The last 2 minutes or so, just some critical reflections really on the Ordnance Survey bicentenary. This is what hopefully will be available in June, by June 2024, the culmination of all this digitization work within our database, publicly available, so you can do all the searches and so on, letters, maps, the drawings, and the memoirs, the text of the memoirs, the name books. And you'll have the facsimiles themselves, as well as metadata associated with those, and also transcriptions of those sources as well. So it's quite a rich material that will be available publicly, and as I say, spatially referenced as well. A set of events. So this is the Mapping Monuments Conference. Is the thing I mentioned on November the 17th. That's the programme. Everybody's very welcome. It only costs £10, I think, to join. That's because you get a free lunch. Okay, so it's in the Drummond Hotel. The Drummond Hotel is not named after Drummond, the surveyor. It's named after the townlands of Drummond, which is kind of quirky, isn't it? Then we've got Trig 200, which is the project I'm running with the National Trust and Ordnance Survey Northern Ireland, OSNI and LPS, where we're going to focus on Divis. That's as part of the Northern Ireland Science Festival. Then the Ordnance Survey 200 conference, and again, you'll be very welcome to that. if you're available, June 20th to the 22nd, the launch of the exhibition. And then also some events planned for OSI, Ordnance Survey Ireland, as there were, Ordnance Survey Northern Ireland, and maybe even others as well, you can advise me on as well. So the whole raft of, we can expect quite a lot of interest, I think, next year in 2024. Going back to the bicentenary of the British Ordnance Survey, i.e. the Ordnance Survey in Britain, it was marked, it was commemorated. There were these volumes produced. I've already waved this one around as well in relation to the Ordnance Survey, NI, OSNI, and also LPA, and also Ordnance Survey Ireland. But OSGB, because the Ordnance Survey split up, of course, after partition, produced this volume here, Mapmaker Sprint, since 1991. Now, that's Britain. We know things are different here. And we know the Ordnance Survey is not the same, not seen here in the same way as it might be in Kent or wherever, somewhere in England. It's a different kettle of fish. And it was this exercise I mentioned, which really, I'm always telling the students to think critically about maps. And this was a shot across the bows for me, actually, as what ensued. So this was the little tweet that was put out by the BBC, based upon the little film they did of mapping monuments. A little quotation, but retracing how Ireland's maps made world history. Like the BBC always like to sort of pick these things up. And there was a little video there that was put up. So that was all on Twitter. What happened next? Okay, well, first of all, we have this response. I don't know if, can you read this at the back, or do you need me to read it out? It said, so this is one of the response. This is really poor. No context given around who and why this mapping was done. The enthusiasm without the context from Professor Keith Lilley is odd. It says, by all means delve into the subject, but to not mention that this was a colonial experiment in Ireland, strange. Right, so pretty cutting stuff. We know what Twitter's like. Dangerous place. So then we had more English historian. Well, I'm not an historian, I'm a geographer, right? But let's leave that to one side. At the anniversary of eliminating indigenous place names and culture, charming. I must send him a wee Brian Friel book. Very patronising, isn't it? There are too many English folk in positions of authority across the 6 counties. And it just goes on. Look at them celebrating their colonialism, how much of an amazing time their people had while doing it, even though it was a community-based, cross-community-based project. Hey, what else were the British doing in Ireland in the 1840s? Anything interesting? And then lastly, this one about Derry, and and below that, somebody signposting me quite literally to translations. So, I hadn't anticipated that. I always felt what we were doing was contextualized sufficiently, but clearly I failed, because this is a kind of response which made me kind of a little bit alarmed, to be honest. And it's part of a bigger kind of sort of shift. This comes from Mountaineering Ireland, an organization about obviously outdoor activities, trying to do some of what's happened in Wales. You've seen recently about Snowdon and Snowdonia, the renaming or reversing the naming to Welsh names. And they're referring to that specifically here, actually, about promoting Gaelic names in Scotland. These original names were rendered, it says here, into their current meaningless approximations during the British mapping project of the country in the 19th century. It's that Brian Friel kind of message that's getting out. It seems to be the thing that has most resonance, even though there'll be those like Mihal and others who will be saying, well, hang on a minute, let's look at what was going on in those name books about standardizing, not necessarily anglicizing, but standardizing place names. So, it's even in the academic discourse. So this is an article in Decolonizing the Map, a paper. Place names are often mnemonic devices. We don't disagree with that, blah, blah, blah. As the Irish patriarch in translations, this quote here, Brian Friel's remarkable play on the English mapping of Ireland in the 1840s remarks, and it's a quote from Friel, English couldn't really express us. So, this critical discourse on decolonizing the map is tapping into that same kind of Friel view of what the Ordnance Survey were doing. And as Friel admitted himself, what he was doing was around art, about play, about performance, creating stories. He wasn't trying to write a history of the Ordnance Survey, but it seems to resonate much more strongly than the John Andrews version of things. And I think that for 2024 is the thing that we need to be conscious of as we enter into 2024, is that, we're caught between the two, between Friel and Andrews, and we're going to try and negotiate that as best we can. So the last point really is just to say this is important stuff for us on the island of Ireland, north and south. It's also important internationally as well because of the connections between the survey in Ireland and the survey in this case India. And I've done work with my colleague Satish Kumar over in Calcutta, looking at these towers that were used by the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India. This is the baseline in Calcutta, following the baseline measurement in Loch Foyle, around Loch Foyle. Everest pretty much took the whole thing, lock, stock and barrel, over to Calcutta and used the same. So interesting issues there. I know Barry Crosby's done work on this, but connections between colonial Ireland, colonial India, which can be explored these ways. So finally, these are our many logos, everybody. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm sorry I've gone over somewhat.
Keith, thank you so much. It's a fascinating and really important project. I'm sure we will have questions. So yeah, let's start.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely fascinating. I work with historical mapping myself.
Yeah.
So my first question is, you said these maps will be available in a georeference format. Will they be searchable? Will the search function involve all the variety of the place names, including the Irish ones, to pick up that controversial discussion towards the end? Yes,
the answer is in short, yes, the maps will be available, but they are already available actually. I mean, the GeoHive Ordnance Survey of Ireland portal already has them. National Library of Scotland have them, but they are just a sheet, so they're not really searchable in that sense. You know, you can look at them, you can pan around, you can zoom and so on. But what we will have is the data around those maps. So there will be we're going to do it by townland. So, you know, let's say you're interested in a particular townland, and if you click on that townland, there will be the information that comes from now the name books. That information will be there for those counties that we've covered. So what we want is more money, because then we could extend this across to the other name books. So the way what you're asking for will work for County Armagh, it will work for County Fermanagh, Donegal, okay, but it won't work, I'm afraid, for I don't know, let's say County Galway, because we don't have that data there at the moment. But it will, if we had more money, you could do that, yeah.
Okay, so for the other counties, you will still have georeference maps.
Oh, you will, certainly.
Yeah.
You'll have all the information from the letters, information from memoirs, if they're there. Of course, they really cover the northern counties anyway, and also the map information. That's right, yes. And the maps themselves as entities, yes, all that will be there. Yeah, yeah, thanks.
There is some existing information on the townlands.ie site about etymologies of townland names.
Yes, yes. It's very complicated landscape where digitally, because there is some existing content out there like townlands.ie, Ask About Ireland, if some of you may be familiar with that, which has, again, PDFs of the letters, in some cases, Donovan's letters. You know, so there are various sources out there, but again, it's a bit sort of disparate, isn't it? You know, you've got to kind of know your way around.
Tends to be very efficient also, because townlands.ie, for example, doesn't have alternative spellings. If there's some old 19th century spelling that's not used anymore, townlands.ie will be completely lost.
Okay, so for that you need Loganum. So we're working with the Irish Place Name Organisation in the south, but also the Place Name Project in the north, the Northern Ireland Place Name Project, which Micheál runs. So they also have a huge database. So I'm just trying to think, actually, I think the idea is we were to connect with those sources. So, I mean, again, this is a question for Zenobia, I think, in many ways, but the idea was to use something called linked open data. And the idea then was to connect our data set with other data sets and to draw in from those other data sets. So yeah, maybe leave that one with me and I can ask Zenobia, but it would be doable if we were able to connect across those different databases, because Loganum have that information. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Keith. That was fascinating. I mean, when you're doing the events next year for Northern Ireland, are you going to take head on that bit of both on colonial maps, but also on what was going on within the Irish language, so that it doesn't, so you have a chance in hell that it doesn't just become the stereotypical debate about these dreadful people that we're not in the countries taken away from people. Yeah,
yeah. I think that's what we're looking at for the conference in the Academy, Royal Irish Academy in June. But yeah, sort of situating 1824 more broadly in a kind of critical way, and you know, so that will be a conference that will have contributions from those involved in the project. So people like Angus, Finnegan and Limerick and Meehall here and so on. So there will hopefully be that kind of critical view on the naming, on the issue around naming and the use of the name books and so on. But as I think you're right, actually, to have something even separate from that, I think is what you're suggesting, where there is this discussion about almost that kind of Andrews Friel kind of issue, you know, and finding that centre ground if it's possible and exploring that. You know, I think somebody like Paul Murphy might be interested in that as well, you know, because he's doing work with the Friel collections, you know, there's the Friel Reimagines project. So that might be another possible.
And you might find out language enthusiasts will still go.
Yes.
I think one of the things I'd say is that I was looking at maps in Tyrone, and even maps that had existed in the 1960s, the more modern versions have dropped some of the Irish.
Okay.
And dropped some of the archaeological words.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's
Irish, yeah.
Because we have been doing some public engagement work in Fermanagh and Donegal. So we did a few kind of work, well, say we, it was mainly Anthony Francis and some of the colleagues who did that work out in the field with Zenobie, to look at what was off the map as much as what is on the map, you know, recognizing that maps are always selective. They silence, they give voice to some, but they silence others. You know, how maps do work in that sense, you know, so that's what they've been exploring through those workshops. And maybe there was scope to kind of begin to draw out from that back into something a bit more like, I think it's a really great idea, to be honest. Yeah, thanks.
So just on the translations point, I mean, there is an interesting map of responses to translations.
Yes.
Because it was a touring play. It starts famously with a standing ovation from, you know, the Guildhall and Derry,
yes,
led by the then DUP there.
Yes.
It then travels through Ireland. When it goes south, responses, reviews begin to change.
Right.
And I mean, if memory serves, it's when it gets to London,
yeah,
and staged at the National Theatre, that Seamus Heaney, of all people, writes a review of it, which turns it into a nationalist.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's, and this is Ophelia Byrne, when she was theatre artist in Liverpool, did this work some years ago. But there is a map, in other words, to be drawn of how reception of translations moves.
A map of response.
It's actually people who now refer to a particular sort of way have no sense of that history of the way it's
right. Okay. So, yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Maybe another little map to draw.
Yes. Let's go out to the pile.
Just a very small point. It's understand that the Ordnance Survey of Ireland name has gone.
Yes.
It's been changed to something else this year, I think, hasn't it?
Yes.
But OSNI still exists, how much?
Well, there's an interesting kind of story there. I mean, OSN Osney actually also disappeared for a while under Land and Property Services, but it's been brought back. So yeah, it's much more kind of visible now than it was a few years ago. Whether this, it seems so sort of, well, it's such a shame in 2023 to lose OSI a year before the bicentenary. It does seem a shame, but you're right. It's been now subsumed in Tulcha Éireann. So it's a bit like LPS in a sense. I think it's about taxation and so on and valuation and all that sort of thing. But that's also a return to Griffiths, of course, isn't it? In some ways, going back to the 19th century purpose of the survey. Yeah.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, wonderful presentation. Of a kind we don't normally have. So that's all to the good. Being slightly devil's advocate for a moment, a small point and then perhaps a slightly larger one. When you were talking about surveyors and the kind of geographies associated with them, those spatial patterns you mentioned, in a way, isn't it what you would expect? A surveyor working in Wicklow on a Monday, you wouldn't expect him to be on the Aran Islands on a Friday or a Saturday or whatever. So that strikes me as just simply an administrative efficiency.
Right.
Instead of a geographical lens, you could have more of an economist's lens on this. But the wider point, and this is perhaps a failure of imagination on my part, you did mention at the beginning, I think, this could, or maybe Peter did, I can't remember which, is to make a major contribution to our understanding of pre-famine Irish society. I just don't see it at the moment, but it may be a problem on my part. I can see wonderful contributions to local history,
Yeah.
to heritage, to a number of cultural issues, linguistic issues, and so on.
Yeah.
But I don't see this as reshaping our understanding of pre-famine Irish economy, society,
No.
politics.
No, I suppose.
Tell me I'm wrong.
No, I don't think. I mean, that's not really what we're not with OS 200. It's really it's twofold. It's to make the data more available as a corpus, to make it more publicly available, more usable, but also to yield these hidden geographies. Now, some of them might, in a sense, be kind of what you'd expect. You know, as you say, you wouldn't expect a surveyor to suddenly move from one distant part to somewhere else. But this is a way of actually putting something actually on the map and saying for sure, this is where Tucker went, and this is where Henry James went. So it's actually being a little bit more precision in that process. And again, thinking about those distances, that are being, and also the way it was managed. You're right. I mean, the whole survey was broken down into districts. So it was very much an administrative exercise, from top to bottom, right from Mountjoy, right the way down to those people in the field. And that's what Andrews writes about, really, 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 a huge amount of detail. But we don't see it. And what I want to try and do with this is, I'm a very visual person. I want to see it. I don't just want to hear that Tucker went from place X to place Y. I want to see it. And I want to see it in relation to where these other surveyors were going as well. And why it is that you get this trajectory, say, from Tucker, but a slightly different trajectory from someone else. And that's one I think we're bringing something new. Now, I don't think we ever really sort of saw it as rewriting pre-famine Ireland, but hopefully the data will make a contribution to those who are interested in that. I mean, in that particular topic. I mean, it will be a rich data set, and it will be analyzable, and it will be searchable. So it'll be a new set of material potentially that could contribute to the base. But it's not really what I wanted to get out of the project. It's more this visualization of the hidden geographies I was looking for. So I hope from that point of view, it will fulfill my desire, but it may not fulfill everybody else's.
I think when the memoirs were republished by the Institute back in the early and mid-90s, that was a major contribution in terms of source material to our understanding, just because of the rich qualitative description of localities in those sources. Now,
see, we've not analysed that yet.
But right. Also, I was recently dipping into O'Donovan's letters, and it does something similar in terms of the cultural geography of pre-famine. And those are, as you say, available in kind of photocopy and then scanned form, and very kind of difficult to use.
They are.
So what this project is doing is both contextualizing those sources, and also then making them much more, critically available. But
also we can then visualize those sorts of things. You're quite right. I should have thought about that. The memoirs, since the memoirs really they're so broad in compass, aren't they? Really, in terms of the economy, society, religion, everything, is all in there. And we've not even begun to actually. I would talk to Zenobia about this, but we've not even begun to visualize some of that material yet. And maybe that's where there might be that contribution that you're looking for. Fair point. No, it's a fair point. Yeah.
That was fantastic. I love it. Maps. I can't wait to look at this in June when it's all out and I can spend hours wasting my time on this. I'm thinking a little bit forward 100 years to when I'm more focused on in the early 20th century.
Sure.
I'm thinking about partition.
Yeah.
And so I guess one is a suggestion to think that we're coming up on the centenary of the Boundary Commission, and this could be particularly helpful for people who work on that. But the other thing is there evidence? Is any of this visualization? Does any of that represent the eventual boundary that does get created? Or have you just offhand even noticed that?
No, but it's an interesting point about the afterlife of this material and where it ends up, especially with partition and the two ordnance surveys on the island, between north and south. Again, I sound like I'm sort of trying to deflect things, but that's the focus really for us is on the 1820s, 30s, really through to 1840s, rather than this afterlife. But it's an important point because a lot of the material we're using, like some of the transcriptions of the letters, do originate from that later period. You see, so it's something we need to be very mindful of is what happens to these sources subsequent. The person who's writing on this, well, the one person I'm thinking of is somebody called Mick Crawley, who was one of our volunteers on the Mapping Monuments project. And he came along and very sort of unassumingly sort of sat down and we just went around the table sort of saying who we all were. And he actually ran the Ordnance Survey at one point. He's worked for the Ordnance he's worked for all 3 Ordnance Surveys, right? Britain, the South and the North. He's a civil servant really by profession, retired now. Anyway, he's writing a kind of institutional history of the Ordnance Surveys, in the plural, of Ireland. And he's tackling exactly that point about what's happening in the organisations around the time of partition, because obviously it's quite traumatic as the whole thing gets sort of split. But I don't think I can read a prehistory. I don't know. Maybe it's something we can think about, but at the moment, I don't think really from what we've seen anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I've been noticed on the Ordnance Survey is this massive change in the definition of what severity. I mean, when they start off, there's going to be a map for every parish,
yes,
and a published memoir.
That's right.
In the event, only one Temple Moor is published.
Yes.
And if you look at the memoirs, as you move into Alpha Ulster, the draft memoirs get thinner and thinner.
Yes.
And then just keep it out.
That's right.
So that's a huge redefinition of what they thought they were doing. Does any of that show up in your data?
Yes, it does. That kind of petering out, and that's why we wanted to map the sources really to show that there are these differences, these variations. In terms of the memoirs themselves, again, that is something we've got the material, in a sense, we've got the textual material, because what Angelique Day provided us with was from the manuscript versions of the memoirs, the actual what eventually became in the print edition, but a kind of interim stage. So what, it's not going to be exactly like the print edition, but instead it was a .txt file, and it had something like millions of characters in it, and that's what we've used, and we've indexed it, and that's where we begin to get maybe to some of the points that you're interested in, charting out over time the content of that material as you go, southwards and over time as well.
I meant more, does the progress of the mapping change once you narrow the focus to just getting the map done and forget about the numbers and so on?
Yes.
You talk about speeding up.
Yes, that's right.
One reason why it speeds up.
I think it's again, it's down really looking at the geography involved. I just think it's a better working process. They're just more in the. It seems to be, and it may well also be. I need to reread Andrews. I mean, maybe it's about resource as well, and getting the money to pay people and so on. But from a kind of practice point of view, you can imagine the difficulty. They're surveying at 6 inches to 1 mile. They've never done that before, not on that scale, not on that size of area. They're also trying to do a trigonometrical survey, which is one aspect. They're also trying to do topographical survey. So there's 2 things going on at the same time, which is really complicated thing to try and do. And I think basically they get more, the machine becomes more efficient, to use that kind of metaphor, as they move southwards. They're able to cover more ground, quite literally. But again, it's the sort of thing that the maps begin to show that up. So now we need to think, well, okay, well, why is that? The maps are really the way of visualizing it, not necessarily always explaining it. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
This may be the dullest question you've had tonight. I don't quite understand about, say, Tucker coming down that eastern side.
Yeah.
And it's nice to know that he was there and Rebecca did an amazing amount of work. What else can we glean from the fact that there were different surveyors? Yeah, or that Tucker was that surveyor.
Yeah, well, it kind of goes back to the image of Fermanagh, and that there are some sheets where you seem to have a multiplicity of surveyors working, and other sheets where you don't, or some areas, townlands, where you don't get that. And what these maps and the maps begin to show is those patterns, because we don't see the patterns otherwise. I mean, they're almost incomprehensible to read all those sheets and imagine it. So only by mapping them do we begin to actually tease out these geographies of the surveyors, where sometimes you get a group of surveyors, maybe the same surveyor, they're working the same areas, they're working in different areas, or working with different teams. So that's all we're trying to, I suppose, help sort of bring out, to excavate from the maps, is that the patterns that we begin to now see in those maps I've just shown you. So that's really just a step in the process, is it not? Then we need to then think about, okay, and that's where the textual material will help, and maybe the letters will help. In some cases, the memoirs might help, and so on, because there'll be biographical information which we can correlate the map biographical information against, and so to build up that picture and the granularity of what's going on the ground. So that's the next stage, really. The maps give us a sort of snapshot of that, but not really a very full picture. Yeah, still deficient. It's not a dull question, it's an important question.
Some extent following on from that, I'm talking about the learning as they went along, new kind of project. Will that granularity be able to include, say, you making a judgment about the competence levels of different surveyors?
Yeah,
are they all supposed to? Are they all supposed
yes.
to be working the same level?
Yes. Yeah.
Clearly, there are going to be variations. I mean, does that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We need to look at that. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that, but yes, that's more of a temporal question than a spatial question. You know, so yes, that would be interesting. I mean, I've been looking at it more spatially from the patterns you've just been seeing rather than the chronology, but you're right, we could get to that level of granularity around particular individuals and their pace. That's kind of like a pace, really, of work. Some are slow, some are fast, maybe. You know, that'd be interesting to look at.
It's a productivity question.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Look at your questions online.
Yeah, there's one question from Robert Gibson. He asks, on the subject of townlands, is there any likelihood of an official request to Google Maps to have them add all Irish townlands and their boundaries to their map app?
Yes, please.
Well, as somebody who I don't like Google Maps, am I on record of saying that?
We can cut it out.
We'll cut that bit out. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Google being based, or at least partly based in Dublin, I would think, you know, there may be something there. And those organisations like Apple and so on with Apple Maps, you know, they are interested in these sort of historical aspects, I think. So I don't know if that answers the question from Robert, but who knows down the line. I mean, but if it were me, I mean, I'm more kind of confident with working with Loganum or working with GeoHive, you know, Ordnance Survey of Ireland and so on, as ways of accessing this information rather than through Google, because Google don't make maps. When you use Google, you use mainly imagery or very basic vectorized mapping. It's really, or the OpenStreetMap mapping is much better if you want to use anything online free. For maps, I'm talking about cartography here. And if you want to know how to get from here to Derry, fine, use your Google navigation. But if you want to look at a map, don't use Google Maps. It's you know, pretty basic. Sorry, Robert. Don't know if that helps. Thanks for your question.
Okay. Any others? Look, just that one. Okay. Any other questions anybody would like to ask?
We're all mapped out.
Yeah. Yes.
This is great. Following on what was just said about perhaps looking more into the geographies of productivity between individual surveyors. This is kind of in a more archaeological background with interest in monuments. That, reading a few papers where they talk about not all the surveyors are very good at following QUB instructions, even at the start, to the letter about what they're including in what they're surveying, particularly with regard to certain archaeological monuments sometimes.
Yes.
And kind of in relation to that productivity question, do you see any avenue using this data to investigate perhaps are certain surveyors, do they have patterns of not doing the work from that point of view as well as others?
Yeah, I think that will come out from the memoirs, because one of our kind of categories will be about place and events, and the events will include archaeological time as well as historical time. So if there are mentions of, for example, like a medieval abbey or something like that, then that will be part of our data set. And if we have the names of those involved, and we do, of course, in the memoirs, because the names appear in there, there may be ways of actually looking at that relationship. So again, that's a really interesting thing for us to think about. I think this is the thing, once we've got the database together, having that kind of, maybe I should come back in about 2 years time. But, you know, actually have a workshop or something where we work through those kinds of issues live with the data set. I think would be really interesting to begin to do that and see what it does yield. It's a good point. Thanks.
There's one very interesting episode you very quickly clicked through in the presentation, Keith, which involved a priest in one of the Ulster counties, either verbally or physically, confronting the surveyors, then being upbraided by the bishop for doing so, the embarrassment that had been caused. I mean, it'd be interesting to know more about those kind of interactions between surveyors and you know, the kind of population of the areas in which they're involved, which takes it back to Friel.
That's right.
In some ways, doesn't it? But I mean, if there's more material in the correspondence,
in the letters,
in the
that's
archival records,
yes,
and kind of geolocating those against the places where those happen as well, that would be fascinating.
And there is, of course, a huge amount of material which we're not including related to the Ordnance Survey in the National Archive, the National Library in Dublin. You know, there's volume, masses of stuff which is in manuscript. Much of it is in manuscript form, some of it's in printed form as well, but a lot of it's in manuscript form, like the notebooks the surveyors used and the little annotated diagrams and things like that. That will be yet another huge project. So it's a stepping stone.
So for future funding,
let's hope so.
Applications, we'll bring in that material as well. I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating project, and we're all looking forward, as people said in the room, to the database is being available by next summer, and also then to the interpretive work, which I know you're working on as well as many other people arising from the project. So much to look forward to in 2024 and beyond. Can we just finish by thanking Keith for coming and explaining and speaking through and talking us through the project today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just before everyone disappears, we've got a seminar next Monday on the 13th. Dr. Ellen McWilliams of Exeter will be coming to talk about her new book, Forgetful Remembrance, The Dunmanway Massacre of April 1922. So that'll be at 4:30 in this room. Everyone's very welcome. Be online as well. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.